The Observer.
Good evening and welcome. My name's James Harding. I'm the founder, as you know, of Tortoise, the editor of The Observer, and I am delighted and very excited to welcome Philippe Sands here. Forgive me if you get a little bit of sound that comes from the mic. That's because we're trying to make sure that everyone can hear and that Philippe and I can have an easy enough conversation. Welcome to the Observer Book Club. We're trying to do something which is rooted in, if you like, the culture that we've inherited in the Observer. David Astor, the great editor and former owner of the Observer, said that journalism is both too interesting and too important to be left up to journalists. So our aim here is to make sure that we all share in the access that we get to people as brilliant and fascinating as Philippe, and that means that I hope in the course of the hour to come, everyone here in this room, if you've got a thought, if you've got an observation, if you've got a question, you'll get the chance to put that to Philippe, which means that I'm going to rattle through a few questions, but I am going to hope that you'll kind of wave in my general direction and we can bring your kind of thoughts and views to Philippe. And this is going to be a test of my abilities to keep time, which, if you know me, are not great at the best of times. We could happily do 4 to 6 hours this evening, not just on this book, but on all the other issues in the world today. Genocide, impunity, the rule of law. Let's do all of those things. But we're going to start, if we might, Philippe, with this. 38 Londres Street. Many of you will have read the Ratline, will have read East-West Street. You describe this book at the end, Philippe, as the third in that trilogy. But you start with a moment, I think it's actually in France, in 1998, in a conversation with your wife, when you've been offered the, I don't know whether you call it the opportunity, to act on the Pinochet legal team. Yes. So what happened then?
So, first off, can I say it's very nice to be with you. Very nice to be at The Observer, and thank you for what you and your staff are doing to keep The Observer great, and thank you all for coming. I have been a reader of The Observer since probably 1970 or something, so a very, very long time. So there are many different starting points one can take, but let's take the one you've suggested. It's the 30th of October, 1998. It's a Friday. I'm in Paris. I've been working on a case with a group of colleagues, but I'm also in Paris because it's my grandfather's funeral. He lived in Paris, and I'm heading off to the Cimetière de Pantin on the outskirts, northeast outskirts of Paris. As I'm leaving, I get a phone call from my barrister's chambers. Philippe, the lawyers for Augusto Pinochet, who had been arrested 2 weeks earlier for involvement in crimes against humanity, genocide, torture, murder, and who is arguing that he's immune from the jurisdiction of the English courts, would like to instruct you to argue that he has absolute immunity. I say to Paul, my then practice manager, off to the cemetery, day off, let's talk about it tomorrow. But to be very honest, I was pretty excited because the Pinochet case was the most significant case on international criminal law since 1945, since Nuremberg. Why? Because it was the first time in human history that a former head of state of one country, Chile, was arrested in another country, the United Kingdom, pursuant to a request for his arrest from Spain, in which he was claiming immunity. So it's the first time a national court would have to decide whether a head of state, a former head of state who commits crimes in another country has immunity. I wanted to be involved in that as a legal academic, as a barrister. And I get to the cemetery and my wife greets me. She's come directly from London. And I say to her with some excitement, as I've just said, Pinochet lawyers have been in touch. She says, will you do it? I say, well, cab rank principle. Are there any barristers in the room? Yes? Okay, so you've heard of the cab rank principle. We're like taxi drivers. Someone says taxi. We're not allowed to say we don't like the look of that person, don't like the politics of that person. If it's before the English courts, there are exceptions. You've got to take the case. So I just said cab rank principle. And she said, well, I think the cab rank principle is bullshit. As you know, she's American. And will you do it? I said, well, cab rank principle. She said, well, fine, do it if you think that requires you to do it, but if you do, we'll get divorced tomorrow. And so I didn't do the case, and there was an exception, which I was able to rely on. I checked with the Bar Council, and 3 days later, Human Rights Watch came along, and I sort of went crawling back to my wife and said, "Can I act for Human Rights Watch against Pinochet?" And she said, "Yes." And so I got a seat at the top table. I mean, we were interveners for Human Rights Watch, so we were not main players, but we were in the room, and that was the crucial thing.
But Philippe, the interesting thing about this book, and or at least your relationship with this whole case, is it as a book, as a piece of writing, it starts, 16 years later or so when you're working on the Ratline?
Yeah. So there's a lot that I didn't know. Pinochet is in London for nearly 2 years, 503 days. He then the courts find he doesn't have immunity, and I go through that whole story. But then there is something strange that happens, and he goes back. Jack Straw allows him to go back to Chile on the grounds that he has been determined to be unfit for trial. We can come back to that. So life goes on. Pinochet was an extraordinary moment in my legal life, and about 15 years pass. In 2010, I start work on what became East-West Street. East-West Street is published in 2016, and just before it's due to be published, I'm working on the sequel to East-West Street. I mean, when I accepted to go to Lviv in 2010 to give a lecture on crimes against humanity and genocide, I had no idea that my life would be changed by this series of books that has come out. One thing leads to another. But I'm already researching the Ratline in late 2014, and the main character in the Ratline is a guy called Otto Wächter, who is the deputy of Hans Frank, who is the main character in East-West Street, who had been Adolf Hitler's personal lawyer. And Wächter escapes, unlike Frank, and I got interested in that story and trace him through his escape to his mysterious death in July 49. And at a certain point, the son of Otto and Charlotte Wächter says to me, "Look, I've got the archive, 10,000 pages, all the family documents, all the letters they wrote to each other, all the postcards, all the transcripts of all the recordings of their conversations, photographs, everything. Do you want to have a look?" "Yeah, definitely." They're in his little Schloss in Vienna, just north of Vienna. I go there, I spend a few days, and while I'm in this 10,000 page archive, and it's all in German, and my German's not great, but it's good enough to be able to get through, I come across a 3-page letter. Sent from Damascus, Syria, to Wächter, May 1949, "Don't come to Damascus, avoid the Arab world, not a good place for us Germans and Austrians, head to South America." Wächter dies, but I'm curious about who wrote this letter. It is a comrade of Wächter's. He worked in the SS office with Wächter in Berlin, and he worked under the direction of Heinrich Himmler and Reinhard Heydrich, and his main job in 41 and 42 was that he is the guy who designed, managed, operated the system of hundreds of small vans that were fitted to go around Central and Eastern Nazi-occupied Europe, gassing people to death in groups of 50, the mobile gas vans. And his name is Walter Rauff. I thought I hadn't known the name, but in fact, we come on to it, I had read him many, many years earlier in 1980, because he is a character right at the end of Bruce Chatwin's fabulous book In Patagonia. Who has read In Patagonia? Yeah, so a few of you will, if you go back to it, it's a little chapter, chapter 96, he comes across Walter Rauff. So I am in Vienna, I Google, who is this guy, Rauff? I discover that he has followed his own advice, gone on the Ratline, gone with his wife and 2 kids to Italy and then to Ecuador. In Ecuador, he makes a new life for himself as a small-time businessman. And then in 1956, he and Edith, his wife, meet a fantastic Chilean couple who say, "You're in the wrong country. You should be in our country, Chile. We like people like you, plenty of Germans around, come to Chile." And so in 58, the Rauffs decamp to Chile, and Rauff becomes the manager of a king crab cannery in Punta Arenas, southern Patagonia, Chilean southern Patagonia. And life's going swimmingly. Then, after 5 years, disaster strikes. The West Germans track him down, extradition attempt to get him back to West Germany to face charges of genocide and crimes against humanity, connection with East-West Street. He gets off the hook because Chile has a 15-year statute of limitations. The crimes occurred in 41 to 42, in 63, 22 years have passed. He can't be extradited. So he goes back to Punta Arenas, and then he makes a great life for himself. Everyone by now knows what he's done because he's been all over the papers. On September the 11th, 1973, Augusto Pinochet leads a four-man military junta that overthrows Allende and takes power in Chile. And Rauff is thrilled. Why? Because the couple who he befriended in 1956 in Quito, Ecuador, were none other than Lucia and Augusto Pinochet. You couldn't invent it.
But the thing that intrigued me, Philippe, is when you come across Rauff's name, you have no idea that he's going to crop up in the Pinochet story, or do you think maybe?
So, probably like a newspaper editor or a journalist, you have hunches. So the moment I see that this guy has ended up in Chile and that he has been responsible for disappearing people in Central and Eastern Nazi-occupied Europe, the thought that comes into my brain is, could it be that he worked with Pinochet on disappearing people after September the 11th, 1973? Thousands and thousands of people were killed and disappeared and tortured and so on and so forth. To this day, 1,300 are still disappeared. And the reason that was interesting for me was that it would draw, if it was the case that Rauff was connected with Pinochet in the disappearance or the crimes of the Pinochet regime, it would draw a direct line through East West Street and Hans Frank into the Ratline and Otto Wächter, through to 1973, the coup d'etat, through to 1998, the case in London, and my desk. There'd be a straight line.
So tell us, let's come to Pinochet in a moment, but tell us about the moment that you discovered that that was indeed the case, that there were vans in Eastern Europe and different kinds of vans in Chile.
So it's a long road. I had the benefit of a fantastic editor when I wrote East West Street, and I've never departed from her advice. And it's different from journalism for a newspaper because you just don't have the space. In a book, you've got the space. And Vicky Wilson, my editor at Alfred Knopf, said, Philippe, what is important is not only that you tell readers what you have found, but how you found it. And that was just fantastic advice, because readers are smart and they ask exactly that question. So the first point of connection, hence the title of the book, was this place called 38 Londres Street. 38 Londres Street is a real place. Londres means London in Spanish and in French. It's in the center of Santiago. It's a beautiful street. Many poets, Neruda, artists lived and worked on it. And number 38 was the Socialist Party headquarters of Salvador Allende. On September the 11th, 1973, it was expropriated by Pinochet, personally signed the appropriation order, and handed over to the DINA, or what will become the DINA, the Dirección de Inteligencia Nacional, Pinochet's secret police, the ones who go around nabbing people off the streets in blindfolds and in sort of uniform, ununiformed. And that becomes first a detention centre, then an interrogation centre, then a torture centre, and then a disappearance centre. And eventually I find a man called Leon Gomez, who was 19 years old in 1974, a student at the university with leftist sympathies. He is taken off the streets, taken to 38 Londres Streets with 6 comrades, none of whom see the world again. To this day, they have all been disappeared, and no one knows what became of them. He was the only one to survive. And he described what happened. I spent a lot of time with him, repeatedly, 5-6 visits, because one of the things that you know is that when you're speaking to people, the first time you meet them, they're sort of sizing you up and they're not really saying anything to you. Second time, they're thinking, okay, he's come back all this way from London, maybe. Third time, they really start talking. Fourth time, you get the full details. And fifth time, but it's also a way of checking whether they're consistent across 3-4 years, and have they changed it. He never once changed his story. And he described what happened to him. He goes into the building, he's taken up to the first floor, he's stripped naked, he's tied to the metal frame of an old bed, electrodes are attached to various parts of his body, and he is tortured. And while he's being tortured, he hears someone speaking in a German voice. And he thinks to himself, who is that person? He has a blindfold, but he's able to take a peek, and he recognizes the face. He will later tell me the reason that he recognized the face was that 10 years earlier, during the Rauff proceedings in the Supreme Court, his face, this man's face, was on the front page of every newspaper in Chile every day for 2-3 weeks. And he was interested in history, and he asked his dad what this man had done, and he remembered the face. And it was Walter Rauff, sitting behind a table in a very neat suit, wearing a tie and particular glasses, and sitting at a typewriter, typing out the answers to the questions, and barking out questions in his raspy, smoky, his big smoker voice, which, Leon Gomez described to me. And from that, I found one or two other people who were victims, one of whom, it was just straight out of an incredible stage play and film called
Death and the Maiden.
Death and the Maiden, Ariel Dorfman's incredible book, where the main protagonist is a woman who is tortured and raped by someone, but she's always hooded, so she never sees the perpetrator, but she hears his voice. And one day, many years later, in very curious circumstances, she hears the same voice. And I met one person who was the manager of another fishery in the port town of San Antonio, who described the voice, and I described it in the book. It's one of the most chilling moments I've ever had when I asked him if I could play him the recording of a man's voice who spoke with a German accent. And he said yes. Someone else had said no, it was too traumatic, he didn't want to hear it. And I press the button and the voice comes on and he just rictus freezes. It's like unbelievable. And I was with someone else. And you know when someone's telling you the truth, or when someone, and he said, yeah, that's the guy. And it was Rauff. So I had two victims, but the barrister side of me is like, wouldn't it be good if we could find some torturers? And eventually I found two guys who were involved in acts of mass killing and spent a lot of time with them. And the way it finally all came together was that I was with a Chilean journalist, Carlos Basso, in the city of Concepcion. I'd just come from a terrible place called Colonia Dignidad. If any of you have got Netflix, watch the 6-part series. It's an extraordinarily awful place. And Basso says to me, I think there's a guy in Santiago when you go back you should meet, but let's call him, let's see if he's willing to meet you. He's called Samuel Fuenzalida. Just to cut to the chase, I say to the journalist, look, I've got 4 photographs of men with the same types of thick-rimmed glasses, Henry Kissinger glasses, they call them in Chile. And can I show him 3 photographs of different men with the same glasses, but different men? And he said, yeah. So I would bring them up on my phone, put them against the journalist's phone, and that would be transmitted up to Santiago. First one, he said no. The second one, who actually was Eric Morecambe, he said no. The third one, he said, yeah, I know that man. Fourth one, he said no. And then we started talking about the third man. And I said to Basso, don't mention his name. Let's just get to the facts. How do you know him? He said, I would go to the headquarters of the Dean of the Intelligence Services about once a week. I was posted at 38 Londres Street. And I saw this man. I didn't know who he was, but we could tell he was important from the way he walked, how he dressed, who he was connecting with. What did this man do? He ran a fishery. Remember, Rauff has been running a king crab cannery in Punta Arenas. So what sort of fishery? Where? He said, it was in the town of San Antonio. It's a very bizarre story. He said, the Pinochet regime expropriated the fishery on the 11th of September 1973. Well, why would they expropriate a fishery? He said, because a few months earlier, that fishery had purchased 310 Chevrolet C10 and C30 refrigerated vans. And those were the vans that were used to transport detainees, and then to disappear people. And Rauff ran that operation. So this is really pretty shocking. I mean, I remember the first time I heard it. But immediately other points of connection came up. So when I had been interviewing Leon Gomez, he'd said to me, and I just made nothing of it, that he'd been taken to 38 Londres Street and then left in it in a refrigerated van of the Pesquera Arauca. But it's a tiny point of detail you don't focus in on, because the way our brains work is, as a journalist, it's the same thing. It's only when you go back to the materials time and time again, you join the dots and you're able to work out what's happening.
But it's that strange thing, Philippe, which is that particular element of the story, the idea of a person that goes from one barbaric, tyrannical regime to another, and does exactly the same thing in it, the vans, or a version of that. But it's so obvious.
You remember, because you obviously read the book attentively, I just come across material that really takes your breath away. So 1965, the great Chilean poet Pablo Neruda puts pen to paper, not for a poem, but for a newspaper article, and he writes an op-ed piece, as we call it today, castigating the Chilean courts for having allowed this Nazi off the hook. Statute of limitations, can't send him to West Germany. And then he writes, the one thing we can say with certitude about Walter Rauff is that he knows everything there is to know about vans. 1965, so 8 years before, the poet has actually predicted what is going to come. And it really is, it's those tiny points of detail.
But there's also in the book, there is incredible excitement about being a lawyer. I was just saying to you downstairs, there's a huge variety of lawyers, some of them brilliant, some of them not entirely brilliant. But the process of bringing the arrest warrant of Pinochet itself was, as you say, it was a momentous thing to have pulled off, and it was an incredibly determined thing to have done. Did you come to the end of that whole process and look at it and think, nearly but not quite?
We'll come on to the question of impunity, because I don't think Pinochet got off the hook entirely, and it's not a case of total impunity. I think it's more complex, because there's a big issue about what moral authority does Spain have.
Actually, it's worth explaining this, because if you've not read the book, it's quite complicated, isn't it? It's a Spanish judge seeking the arrest of a Chilean leader in London.
Yeah, so maybe let's just go back a little bit. So in 2021, the Ratline comes out in Spanish. I'm by now embarked on writing this book, and I do an interview for El País, and I'm asked by the journalist, what are you doing next? I said, Pinochet. And that's mentioned in the article. A few weeks after the book comes out in Spain, I get my editor at Anagrama, my publisher in Spain, gets in touch and says, we've got this Spanish prosecutor who wants to be in touch with you. Can I give him your email? Sure. We do a Zoom because it's during COVID. And he has contacted me because he wants to explain to me how the Pinochet case really started. It was nothing to do with the famous lawyer Balthazar Garzón. It was him, Carlos Castrosana, sitting in his office in April 1996 when he receives a visitation from 4 Chilean refugees in Spain who say, could you explore the possibility of bringing a case against Pinochet in the Spanish courts under the theory of universal jurisdiction? Certain crimes are so terrible, genocide, crimes against humanity, torture, that any country in the world can exercise jurisdiction. He says, yes, I'll look into it. He looks into it. He concludes that there is a basis under Spanish law, convenes the 4 refugees, the Chileans, and says to them, yep, there is a basis to go forward, but Spanish courts are very conservative. So it will be better if we started the case with a Spanish national as a victim. Can you go and get me some names? They go away, they come back with 4 names, and he chooses one person, a man called Carmelo Soria, who was the head of the UN office in Santiago in 1976. And in July 1976, the 14th of July 1976, he's on his way to work, he's abducted, and his body is found in a canal 2 days later. He's been murdered by the Pinochet regime. And he takes that case because Carmelo Soria comes from a very distinguished Spanish family. His grandfather was a famous urban designer, designed large parts of Madrid, the street layouts in modern Madrid. And his brother, Carmelo Soria's brother, Arturo, is the publisher of Pablo Neruda. So a lot of people know him. We'll take that case.
And you should mention.
I will mention. So that becomes the case that starts the whole thing. And eventually, 2 years later, in October 98, which we'll come to, leads to the desk of Garzón to decide whether to intervene when it turns out Pinochet is in London. We can come to that bit. The case is remarkable the stories also remarkable for the number of coincidences that keep coming up. So I told this story to my mother-in-law. You've heard about my wife, now you can hear about her mother. And she is a refugee from the Spanish Civil War. She was born in 1935, and she came, her dad was a colonel in the Spanish army, anti-Franco, and in 1940 they come to Britain as refugees and are taken in by the Elmhursts at Dartington. And so my wonderful mother-in-law grew up in Dartington, and so we spent a lot of time in Dartington. In fact, I'm down in Totnes having lunch with her when I tell her this story. I've just done the interview by Zoom with Castrosana, and I tell her the story as I've told it to you, exactly as I've told it to you. And she pauses and says, what was the name of the Spanish gentleman who was abducted in July 1976 and killed by Pinochet? I say, Carmelo Soria. She looks at me and she says, of course, I'd forgotten, cousin Carmelo. And so it turns out that, 23 years after the Pinochet case, my wife's own family occupies a central place in the book. And an hour later, I'm on the phone to Carmen Soria, the daughter of Carmelo Soria. And of course, when I get to Santiago a few weeks later, I'm treated as family. And once you're treated as family, the doors open and the information flows open in different ways because there's trust. Trust is everything. It's all about trust when you're talking to people. Mm-hmm. You know that.
So, I mean, it's just incredible. And
it's crazy. It's a crazy story.
I mean, there's an amazing moment where Philippe has to go and interview someone who's actually signed the documents that enable the arrest warrant, because it turns out is your next door neighbour. I mean, these things are
Well, we should just
close.
Share that one, because lest you think that the whole Pinochet thing was this sort of well-orchestrated global conspiracy. It wasn't. It was just a series of accidents, basically, because we know that's how life actually really is. But the arrest warrant was... So what actually happens is that Garzón, when he hears Pinochet's in London, decides I'll send him a few questions to answer as a basis for a later request for a possible arrest warrant. But on the morning of Friday the 16th of October, which turns out to be the day he will be arrested, he gets a phone call from the number 2 at the British Embassy in Madrid, a lovely, lovely man called John Dew, who says to him, look, I know you've been following this Pinochet saga. I just wanted to let you know that I've had word that Pinochet's leaving tomorrow morning, Saturday the 17th. So if you are going to act, you should move quickly. I find John Dew and interview him at length, and he explains that the reason he'd done that was not some vast conspiracy, but that the British and the Spaniards had had a lot of problems with money laundering in Gibraltar. And Garzón had been very helpful to the British, and he wanted to repay and express his gratitude by giving him a tip-off. The effect is dramatic. It changed everything that happened. Instantaneously, Garzón rips up all the questions he was going to send via Scotland Yard and writes by hand a request for his arrest and extradition to the United Kingdom immediately and faxes it off to Scotland Yard, who then receive it and under the Extradition Act have to get a judge to authorise his arrest. 7:30 in the evening, after hours, the duty magistrate. The duty magistrate happens to be my next door neighbour. I mean, I didn't know it at the time. Nicholas Evans of Christchurch Hill, Hampstead, an absolutely wonderful person.
Lovely.
And a fine neighbour, we get on really well, never given an interview to anybody, but because I'm the neighbour and he trusts me that I'm going to look after him and not be mean or anything, he tells me exactly what happened, and it's sort of amazing. He said, well, yeah, I got a phone call. You know, they told me the name. He said, I'm not like you, Philippe. I didn't do international law type of stuff. It didn't really ring any bells. Vaguely familiar, but I didn't, you know, I Googled it a bit and had a look, but it was pre-internet really, and so I didn't know. And then these 4 officers from Scotland Yard turned up with a draft arrest warrant, and I looked at it and it said, you know, Spanish judge wants him arrested and extradited to Spain. And what's the crime? The crimes are genocide, torture, crimes against humanity. So, well, it was 1998. I'm not like you, Philippe. I didn't do international law. I'd never heard of these things. So I crossed them all out and I wrote murder. Disaster. English courts don't have jurisdiction over the crime of murder committed in Spain. It's not an international crime. It has to cross the threshold, crime against humanity, war crime, genocide, to give the English courts jurisdiction. So that causes...
But I love the fact he just busks it.
But he didn't really screw up in a certain sense, because today we all hear about crimes against humanity, genocide and all these things. In 1998, no one was talking about these things. There'd been no cases. Nothing had happened after Nuremberg. It all began in the late 1990s.
Philippe, can we do this? I want to come back because we've got to this moment where Pinochet is arrested and as you say, there's sort of nearly 2 years of kind of legal drama that flows from that, and then a deal. But let's come back at the end of the deal, because you touched on 2 things that feel extremely current. And when you read the book, the book is incredible in that you feel history extremely close, but I think at this moment particularly close, because the words and the ideas at the heart of the book are just everywhere today, right? Impunity. I mean, let's start with there. You've chosen as this title 38 Londres Street on impunity.
I didn't. I was opposed to the title, but it was
okay.
So when you're publishing a book, as many of you will know, it's an iterative process with a lot of people involved. There'll be the publisher, there'll be your agent, there'll be your editor, there'll be the marketing people, there'll be the author, and I was very insistent that it be 38 Londres Street. And the publisher said, but it's a foreign word, English people don't buy books with foreign words in the title. I said, well, they might, they could be persuaded. It was originally going to be, in Spanish, it's Londres 38. Londres 38. And they said, well, we can't have that as the title because everyone will think it's about the Second World War. And so we settled on 38 Londres Street, and then I wanted Pinochet in London and Nazi in Patagonia. And that was going along swimmingly until Georgia Garrett, my fabulous literary agent, said, no, that's wrong, Philippe. And Jenny, my fabulous editor, this is a book about impunity. And impunity is what's going on right now in our world, in front of our very eyes, in Ukraine, in Gaza, in Palestine, in Israel, in Sudan, in all over the place. We've got to have impunity in the subtitle. And there was a long discussion about it. And I in the end was sort of abstemious. Jenny was against, and Georgia just said, no, you've got to have the word impunity in the subtitle. And she was right.
She was right. Yeah. So can we just talk about a few elements of that? Let's start with genocide. There will be people in this room who have different views of this, but what is yours? What is the definition of genocide, and is Israel committing it in Gaza?
So the definition is set out in a convention adopted in 1948, to which most of the countries of the world are parties. The intention to destroy a group in whole or in part. And the key issue is what is intention. And that has been interpreted over the years by various international courts and tribunals, including in cases in which I've been involved. And they've set a very high bar and a very high threshold. And I know that because I've argued some of the cases in which the court has said, no, to prove an intent, you've essentially got to prove it's the only reasonably inferable intention to explain why something is happening. And that opens the possibility that if there's 2 or 3 or 4 intentions behind an action, it's going to be very difficult to prove that it's genocide. That's a far departure from the definition of genocide that Lemkin had originally conceived of and that I wrote about in East-West Street. So there is a gap today in what regular smart folk think of as genocide, which is basically mass killing on a very large scale, and the legal definition. And the reason that I hesitate to answer your question explicitly is there are 2 cases before the International Court. One of them is South Africa versus Israel, but that's the second on the conveyor belt. The first one, which is coming up in January, the hearings open on the 12th of January, and I'm one of the lead counsels for the Gambia against Myanmar, concerns the mistreatment of the Rohingya community in Myanmar, most of whom have fled to Bangladesh. And that case is based on the Genocide Convention. So in that case, the judges are going to revisit the definition of genocide. And Myanmar will argue exactly as Israel will argue, it's not genocide, we're acting in self-defense, threat to national security, anti-terror activity. And the answer to your question will turn on what the judges say in the Myanmar case in very large part.
So how do you, if you're representing Gambia, or how does the council representing South Africa prove intention?
Well, unlike the German experience, people learn from the German experience, you tend now not to leave pieces of paper lying around saying, oh, and I intend to destroy this group in whole or in part. So you have to infer intent from a pattern of behaviour. And that's notoriously difficult. I mean, or at least different reasonable people will infer different intents from the same pattern of behaviour. There'll be people in this room who will interpret what's happening in Ukraine or what's happening in Gaza differently in terms of what's the actual intention. The job of the judges is to strip it down and work out what they believe is the predominant intent as reflected in a pattern of behaviour. And the reason, I mean, I did a comment for the New York Times this morning on the report the UN's Office of High Commission for Human Rights put out. And I was very careful what I said because I'm counsel in the Gambia case and judges don't like it. And barristers should not be going around saying, this is genocide, that's genocide, blah, 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 or not, or whatever, when you're involved in the cases or in related cases. So I won't say that. So all I said to the New York Times people today was, this is a serious report, it is an independent report, and it needs to be read very carefully by those who are involved in this, including those who are advising Israel. It will have far-reaching consequences, I suspect.
And Philippe, can we just step around a few things? One is just timing. When does the ICJ hear the Israel case?
So the ICJ will hear the Gambia-Myanmar case from the 12th to the 30th of January. A judgment will come in July, or thereabouts, usually about 6 months later. And I suspect the South Africa-Israel case will be in the autumn of 2026, and the judgment will follow after that, because that's the kind of procedure that the court follows. I don't know that exactly. I'm not speaking from any inside knowledge, but that's roughly the timetable that would come. But it's quite clear. Everyone understands that the Myanmar case is, in a sense, it's a very important case on its own, but it's also a stalking horse for the case that is coming. And if the judges don't find genocide in relation to Myanmar, that, I suspect, will have consequences for the South Africa-Israel case, and vice versa.
And if the ICJ does find that it's genocide in Israel, in Israel's case, what is the consequence of that?
Well, we get back to some of the issues that I addressed in East-West Street. There are two international courts in The Hague, and there's often confusion about this. There's the International Court of Justice, which only hears cases involving states, not individuals. And there's the International Criminal Court, which only hears cases in relation to individuals, not against states. The ICJ has a case on genocide brought by South Africa against Israel. The International Criminal Court has indicted 3 individuals from Hamas and 2 individuals from Israel, not for genocide, but for crimes against humanity and war crimes. Now, it may open the door to genocide, I don't know, but at this point, that has not been done. And that sends a signal to the judges of the International Court of Justice. With the ICC, a ruling against an individual means that individual is convicted of the crime of war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, crime of aggression. And that attaches only to the individual, not to the state. The International Court of Justice ruling is not a criminal standard, but more a sort of civil torture standard, and it will have the effect of characterizing the state as responsible for genocide. And what you need to understand is that in all the years since the Torture Convention was adopted in 1948, no state has ever been found to be responsible for genocide. The closest that has ever happened was in 2007 in the case brought by Bosnia against Serbia. The International Court of Justice followed the approach of the Yugoslav War Crimes Tribunal and ruled that a genocide had happened at Srebrenica. That was a genocide. But, said the court, Serbia was not responsible for perpetrating the genocide. What Serbia was responsible for was failing to prevent paramilitary groups from perpetrating a genocide. It's a very significant difference. And so Serbia was not found responsible for genocide as such.
So your point about the Rohingya case is, if the court does find the Myanmar government responsible, it will pave the way for another state. It will be the
first time in history that a state is found to be responsible for the crime of genocide. Now pause for a moment and ask yourself the question, what is the social utility of labelling an entire country genocidal? In 1945, rather wisely I think, proceedings were not brought against Germany or the German people as a whole. They were brought against individuals who were in the upper echelons of the Nazi Party or the Wehrmacht or the SS or whatever. And that meant that with the Nuremberg judgment, it wasn't the whole of Germany that was condemned. And that, I think, was a very wise decision taken because it allowed the country to recover. And I think from the perspective of judges, I don't know this from speaking to them or anything, but I sit as a part-time judge. The idea of placing on the forehead of an entire country and all of its people forever, for Myanmar, this is an issue for me as counsel against Myanmar. I'm essentially asking the International Court of Justice to characterize the whole of Myanmar and all of its people indirectly as responsible for genocide. That's a big burden for a judge.
So Philippe, forgive me, I just want to do 2 more things. I do want to make sure we get the lights and we get some of the views. So then, are we not then in quite a difficult spot where you could see a situation where judges will not make that call on the state of Israel, but that a number of Western states who are signatories to the ICC say, look, we're not going to take the ICC's requirement of an arrest warrant on Netanyahu seriously? And are you not more worried then that actually you end up in a place where one judge won't come to a judgment and the other judge has but won't have any teeth?
So in relation to the International Court of Justice, I think that what you want to watch very carefully is what happens in the Myanmar case, because I think that will determine the appetite of the judges to go the next step in relation to what is happening on the ground of Gaza. I mean, just to be crystal clear, what happened on October the 7th is a crime under international law. What has happened in Gaza since is a crime under international law. There are different ways of characterizing those crimes. War crimes, crimes against humanity, some will say. Genocide, the courts may well say. Genocide, well, they may not, we don't know. For an international lawyer, there's no hierarchy of crimes. The killing of 8,000 Bosnian Muslim men at Srebrenica was not a worse crime than the killing of 3 million Congolese from the Democratic Republic of Congo, which was only a crime against humanity and a war crime. So we've got ourselves into a bit of a mess in terms of the hierarchies of these crimes. And as we go forward, I'm sure the judges will be thinking through the consequences of this. The issue you've asked about the International Criminal Court arrest warrant for Putin and Netanyahu is more complex. As a party to the statute of the International Criminal Court, you have an obligation to arrest them. So if they turn up in this country, as a matter of your treaty obligation, you'd be under a duty to arrest them because the ICC has ruled they don't have immunity. But in general international law, there is a bigger problem for both Putin and Netanyahu. And it is this: neither Russia nor Israel are parties to the statute of the International Criminal Court. And so those countries argue that the immunity their serving head of state can have under international law cannot be removed by a treaty to which they are not a party. And that is the issue that comes up in relation to those two individuals. And the reason the Pinochet case was so important, you're now coming to see, is it was the first time that a former head of state was arrested pursuant to issues in national courts. But if he had been a serving head of state, he would not have been arrested. And so we're in the early stages of working out how we deal with all these kinds of issues. And in the judgments in the House of Lords, which was extraordinary to be present in the arguments, they were dealing with these issues. And in their questions to the lawyers and in their rulings, in their judgments, they were exploring all of these issues. That's the extraordinary power of those judgments. They are stalking horses for what we're dealing with now.
Comes one other matter of judgment. Is Palestine Action a terrorist organisation?
I mean, it's been determined to be such by English law, but I've got to say I find the decision to so characterise it really difficult to understand. I mean, I had lunch yesterday with somebody who stood outside Parliament with a piece of paper. This is a very well-known poet who stood outside Parliament with a piece of paper, just with a few words on it. And she's been arrested. And she's going to find out soon if she's being charged. And to my mind, it's just totally crazy to subject someone who protests in that way, peacefully, with training for peaceful protest, to be characterised as a terrorist, aiding a terrorist organisation. That's my personal view. But it is the law. And so as a barrister, I'm bound by the law, and I'm bound to respect the law. Would I have passed this law? No, I would not have passed this law. Is this law going to cause tremendous difficulties? Yes, it is going to cause tremendous difficulties, and I suspect they're going to find some sort of face-saving way out. And you know.
Sorry, I've done an absolutely lousy job. There were just too many things to talk about. And there's someone at the back here who's got their arm up. Thank you, Lily. Will you just introduce yourself?
I'm trying to hear me.
Yes, Kat, very well.
Okay, hi, I'm Francis. I work in the NGO sector, and I'm curious because this comes up a lot in our work about the end of multilateralism, and we're kind of like doomsayers around the opposite moment about how it doesn't matter how many tribunals we contribute to, it doesn't matter how many times we have grassroots testimony that we put forward to various different tribunals, etc., because ultimately justice doesn't exist anymore. So even if you do get a ruling a la Putin, which is that he should be, answerable for his crimes, because of the state-to-state breakdown on multilateralism, like what we're seeing with Trump at the moment, it doesn't really matter. And I suppose I want you to give me some sort of hope, really, that multilateralism will come back.
I can do that.
Ultimately, it feels like it's kind of fruitless. And I also feel very sorry for you, because I feel like it must be quite hard to be someone who's been a perpetrator of justice for so long, to see that justice doesn't seem to work anymore. Does that make sense? It does.
It totally makes sense. But for me, international justice, international law has always been a long game. If I feel gloomy and doomy, and sometimes I do, I need little things to, perk me up. And there are things that are perking me up. I mean, the decision, for example, on Chagos to allow the Chagossians to go back, pursuant to the decision of the International Court of Justice, is a remarkable shot in the arm for the idea of international rule of law and international justice. So is the creation of a special tribunal for the crime of aggression in relation to Ukraine, which is a direct result of East-West Street. That decision flows from an article I wrote for the FT, and the reason they asked me to write 700 words on Ukraine international law was because of East-West Street. So ideas can still have an impact, but plainly, what we're seeing now on our screens, whether it's Ukraine or Sudan or Gaza and Israel, is utterly appalling and totally inconsistent with the values that were articulated in 1945. But go back to the two main characters of East-West Street. Okay? Our times today are not worse than they were in 1939 or in 1940. Lauterpacht, who concocts the notion of crimes against humanity under international law in 1945, Lemkin, who invents the word genocide in November 1944 in his book, when they did their work, had no idea what had become of their families, did not know they'd lost every member of their family, were in a position of utter darkness. It would have been legitimate for them to go into a corner of a room, curl up and weep. They didn't do that. They had ideas, and they pushed those ideas, and those ideas eventually bore fruit. And that's what I have to do, and that's what you have to do, and that's what other people have to do. You don't just give up because there's these other people around trying to deconstruct the system of values and institutions that were put in place. I think it's going to get worse before it gets better. I'm not optimistic in the short term. Indeed, I'm very, very pessimistic in the short term. But in the longer term, what always happens, if you go back over 300 years, is they erect some sort of system of international institutions and rules and bodies, and then they get torn down in some terrible conflict, and then they always say, oh, we've got to rebuild, and we'll rebuild on the basis of what we did before. And that, 1815, 1848, 1914, 1918, 1939, 1945, that's the way it goes. And so now is bad, no question. But that's not a reason to give up.
Other views, thoughts, questions? Yes, I'm sorry. Hello. Yeah, do shout if we can't. Or Lily, can you get a mic? Oh, thank you so much.
Thank you so much. My name is Nadeshda. I'm also a legal advisor in the NGO sector. And my question is, I share your hope in some ways, but I would say that there's a very selective nature about accountability. So even in the 1940s, there have been Nazis that were prosecuted, and there was some semblance of accountability, though not enough. But at that time period, the US dropped atomic bombs on Japan. There's been no accountability. And I still see that to this day, where we talk about Ukraine, there's accountability that, well, the West at least is supporting these mechanisms. But when it comes to other contexts, there hasn't been that sort of momentum. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts.
Show me a country that has not adopted a double standard in relation to, everyone does it. Let's start at home, Iraq. A total catastrophe. Has there been accountability for Iraq? No. The main protagonist from Iraq in this country wanders around sucking up vast sums of money and is free to travel around. It's a scandal. Sorry, it's a scandal. Is he a good friend of yours?
No, but I'm intrigued to know. I'm intrigued to know. What would you do? What would you do? You would seek to take Tony Blair to court?
The war in Iraq was manifestly illegal. And how can we say, oh, you've violated international law, you, Mr. Putin, you've illegally invaded a country? Putin used the same argument. He used the same argument. We can't have weapons of mass destruction. We can't have nuclear weapons in Ukraine. And so, they don't think through these things. The double standard is everywhere. The Russians, bomb on a daily basis, killed some of my friends, Victoria Amelina, the writer, and then they complain about the targeting of civilians in Gaza. Where's that? The South Africans complain about what's going on in Gaza and then welcome Mr. Lavrov with open arms. The double standards are everywhere, and our job is to point out those double standards. I'm not saying necessarily that any particular person who decided to take Britain to war on a false premise should do time in a particular court. But has there been a real accountability for those actions other than the shaming of the individual? And the fact that he cannot walk in the streets of this country, it's actually very similar to Pinochet. Pinochet, by the end of his life, he didn't get off completely. He was indicted, he was under house arrest, he could not walk in the streets.
But Philippe, I'm going to ask you to finish up just there, but there's a gentleman there with glasses, I think. So, yes.
Hi, I'm James.
Hello.
To say the Observer backed the Iraq War, as I recall.
Indeed, yes, you're right.
Well,
It
more,
did.
more interestingly, we, on the day that I did an opinion piece, saying that the targeting of Iran was unlawful, I did an opinion piece for you. The newspaper supported it.
Yes.
So that's freedom of expression.
Can I ask about the British establishment's relationship with Pinochet, Thatcher, Northern Lamont? Did you go into that?
Oh, yes.
You will find that present, yes indeed.
And much more. Why don't you actually... So what's your name?
I'm James.
James, very good name. James, why don't we try and end there? Because one of the things that's at the very, very heart of this is in the end the deal and the fact that Pinochet does return to Santiago. What's your... Do you want to explain how that happens, Philippe? And also, just a little further than that, in the end, how that made you feel?
So what happened was that rumours began to percolate at the end of 1999 that perhaps Pinochet was unfit for trial, and in the end a series of independent medical records were obtained to determine that he was unfit for trial. I was actually retained at that point by the government of Belgium to get access to those medical records, and we succeeded in the English courts, and those medical reports were then passed over by various other doctors who said, no, he's absolutely fine. And of course, people remember that when he then flew off to Chile, famously, he gets to Chile airport and he's wheeled off the plane and he stands out, waves his stick and looks to be in absolutely rude health. Jack Straw told me that was a shocking moment because he understood at that moment that actually the wool possibly was pulled over his eyes. So we always had a suspicion that something else had happened, but no one has ever been able to find out what has happened. So I mean, this is a sort of double investigation. One is that issue, what really happened to get Pinochet back, and the other is the Rauff story. My work on that really begins with my favourite character in the whole book, who is the interpreter retained by Scotland Yard to interpret every time Scotland Yard has an interaction with General Pinochet. Her name is Jean Pateras. She's a dual national, Chilean-British. She's been a Scotland Yard interpreter for years, still is today. She's a fantastic person. She goes into the room and is the one who delivers the news to Augusto Pinochet that he's under arrest for mass murder, genocide, crimes against humanity. And of course, I just say to Jean, well, so how did he react? What did he do? She said, well, he was in bed, he was in his PJs, and he looked at me and he said, I know the fucker who's behind this.
He was right, by the way.
He was right.
Yeah.
He was totally right. So Jean is then with Pinochet for the next 503 days. She literally escorts him, pushes him onto the plane when he leaves. And she's the one who opened up for me the avenues that I would pursue. For example, she goes over once, this is in September 99, and she's quite chummy with, she doesn't like him, but she's quite chummy with him. And he says to her, Jean, something extraordinary happened yesterday. What's that, my general? He says, a lady came to visit me yesterday. We had a marvellous afternoon together. And then she left. And I went to the police officers and I said, well, what a lovely lady, but who is she? Tell me who she is. And the police officers said to me, she was my wife. And Jean, of course, saw what he was doing. He was faking being demented. And she spotted it straight away. She saw what was going on. And indeed, eventually, as one thing leads to another, I identify the person in the Chilean foreign ministry who is charged with dealing with the British. And his name is Christian Tolosa. He's a remarkable individual. He's chosen to lead the efforts to bring Pinochet back and to negotiate with the British for the best of reasons. He has done a PhD in psychology at Exeter University. And it is believed on the Chilean side that therefore he knows how the British mind works. He couldn't invent it. And he devises a three-pronged strategy. He's anti-Pinochet, and this is he's just doing his work as a civil servant, but it succeeds. A three-pronged strategy. Step one, let the British bask in the glory of their legal system and how fantastic they are and justice and everything. But at some point, there will be a disaster. And at the point of disaster, we move into step two. What's the point of disaster? The Hoffman story before the House of Lords, when they have to set aside the House of Lords judgment because Lord Hoffman has failed to disclose that he's on the board of Amnesty International, that his wife works for Amnesty International, who are interveners in the case. That's the moment where they spring into action with their plan to get the British out of an embarrassing pickle. And that will be to persuade them that he's unfit for trial. And that is the next thing that happens. And step one is to persuade the Brits to open that possibility. And that's the point at which Christian Tolosa comes to London repeatedly and meets with his counterpart, who's none other than Jonathan Powell, the Chief of Staff at 10 Downing Street. And I've interviewed both of them, and they've both confirmed absolutely, it's all the details are in the book, exactly the same stories, totally consistent. And on the British side, they want something out of the deal. And what they want is they want confirmation that when Pinochet returns, he will be stripped of his immunity and he will be investigated and, as appropriate, prosecuted. So Tolosa has to bring evidence to London that will get them over that hurdle. And that has become a very big drama in Chile. The book has caused mayhem in Chile, although not as much mayhem as the evidence that I found that the Chileans had actually prepared a 10-page dossier for General Pinochet on training him on how to fake dementia. You really couldn't invent it. It's unbelievable. All of that's now in the book. None of it's been challenged. None of it has been said to be untrue. The book's been out in Chile for 4 or 5 months. It's been out here for 5 months. No errors, it's clear. We now know what has happened. And so he ends up going back. I have mixed feelings about his going back, because although Spain has a legal basis to have initiated the whole proceedings, I do have a problem with Spain as the former colonial power responsible for Chile seeking to apply its criminal legal order to crimes committed in Chile when Spain has done precisely zero in relation to the crimes of the Franco regime. So what moral authority does Spain have to seek to do justice? But there are all sorts of clues all over the place, and one, and it's the kind of clue that you would have picked up on, is when I read Tony Blair's memoir on his premiership, one of the things that jumped out of the pages was the absence of even a single mention of Chile or Pinochet. This was the most important criminal justice case since Nuremberg for these big issues of immunity and impunity. If a British Prime Minister doesn't mention it, there's got to be a reason he doesn't mention it. And the reason is, of course, he doesn't want to talk about it. He doesn't want to be asked about it. So he passes in silence on it. And that, in a sense, was one of the biggest clues for me about something had happened.
So let's finish exactly there, on understanding the British mind. Because you do end up there thinking, the UK did a deal.
Yeah.
A deal that in its boots knew was wrong.
Except, was it wrong? This is the complexity. And my style of writing is that I don't impose on readers my views. It's for you to work out what you think. These are complex questions. Because what actually happened? Until March 2000, until October 1998 when Pinochet is arrested, and March 2000 when he goes back, there has been not a single trial for the crimes of the Pinochet dictatorship, because there's a blanket amnesty.
Inside Chile, you mean?
Inside Chile.
Yeah.
Nothing. The courts cannot touch the Pinochet regime. The deal that is made does allow Pinochet to return, which upsets a lot of people, but it also strips him of his immunity. His immunity is removed, and the gates of justice begin to open. It comes back to the sort of hopefulness arguments, and as a consequence of the deal struck by the British and the Chileans, hundreds of people have been prosecuted. Many are serving life sentences. Many have died while serving their life sentences. And the path of justice changed in Chile. And so it could be said, if you believe that ultimately it's for Chile to take ownership of its own crimes, which I sort of do believe, that what the British did opened the door to justice in Chile. And that's a good thing. So it's really complicated. It's anyone who says it's black and white, and it's actually reasonable people can disagree.
No, I'm in the same spot. I think it was Francis who started this out by saying, look, we're grasping for hope. So on that basis, Philippe, the path of justice can change.
Yes.
It's a hopeful path.
And it's a long game.
Philippe is kindly willing to sign books. As you can tell, it's brilliant. It's brilliant. It goes in many, many different places. Do pick up a copy. You will love reading it. But for now, please join me in thanking Philippe Sands.
Thank you.
The Observer.